chain puzzles where they have like pieces of metal that have weird shapes and they're kind of linked together. And your goal is to like get them unhooked from each other. And sometimes if you're just jiggling it around, sometimes they just come apart and you're like, wait a minute, how did I do that? And so it's certainly possible to solve a problem without learning any enduring method. Learning through observation is a very important feature of how we learn.
How can organizations help their people get the expertise?
I mean, there's an interesting kind of debate within psychology itself of whether unlearning is even possible.
Improvement is not a straight line. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about your book, Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. This is a really well thought out book. There's a lot of good stories, lots of great action items and nuggets. So we're going to jump around and I'm going to try to cover the most I can in the book, but I encourage people to go get it because there's a lot of really good tools in this. So in the introduction, you describe how modern Tetris players have dramatically improved their performance through the use of like online platforms and sharing techniques. Whereas I'm sure we all played Tetris back in the day and, in the 80s and 90s. But I'm curious, like maybe tell the story about how these players are dramatically improving their performance, and then maybe parallel that with how do we in the modern workforce incorporate something like that?
Yeah, so this is like a fun story. I first heard about this from John Green. He had a YouTube channel, and I think the title of his episode was like, "Why are humans suddenly getting better at Tetris?" which is very thought-provoking. And the argument is that now, and first I've got to make the claim that people are much better at Tetris, because this seems sort of like a little bit of an offbeat example, but basically the way I would put it is like sort of the measures that we have for Tetris performance. If you can think about like the 4-minute mile, like the other example of this, that, like once people started running the 4-minute mile, more people started running the 4-minute mile. It's a little bit like if before someone ran the 4-minute mile, like people were only running like 20-minute miles or like it took like a half an hour. And then now all of a sudden you have like 12 or 13-year-old kids doing 4-minute miles. So like people are really much, much better at this game. And the explanation that makes the most sense to me is that when the game came out, people were playing it a lot, but there wasn't really an opportunity to learn from other people or for the best techniques to get spread widely. So you have people who figure out some technique, but then it kind of like just stays with them. Or you have like really, really good players who are using a known bad strategy because they don't know that it's actually worse than something else. They're just figuring things out on their own, and they only can reach a certain level of play. Whereas today we have the internet, we have live streaming, we have like, have cameras on the person's hands. Like it turns out the best way to play the game is to use this like really weird technique where you like hold the controller upside down. And you have like a glove on one hand, and that allows you to like flick it kind of like you're strumming a guitar, and that lets you press the buttons faster than you can normally. Like it's super weird stuff that you wouldn't pick out on your own. Now, Tetris is a little bit of an offbeat example, but I think it represents a really deep principle that's not true just of Tetris, but is true in all domains of human activity, which is that the speed at which we can innovate, the speed at which we can learn, really crucially depends on how easy it is to learn from other people. So if you're in environments where for some reason it's harder to learn from other people, it makes it much harder for knowledge to get disseminated. It makes it much harder to innovate, and ultimately slows progress of the field. So obviously the example in workplaces is if most of the knowledge of how to do things in your organization is in the heads of a few old timers, you're going to have a really hard time progressing as a company, innovating as a company. And in contrast, if you are able to take that knowledge and transmit it more widely, you're able to have it so that it's easier to onboard new people. That makes a huge difference in learning. So, I mean, we could dig into this. There's like so many examples of this, but the Tetris one really stands out especially because it's so recent. We're talking about something that's taken place in the last like decade or two.
There's a funny thing about that Tetris example is I see it with my son. He plays Fortnite, and I catch him when he's not playing. He's watching YouTube videos of people playing Fortnite and learning like weird techniques and how to click faster. And I'm like, what's happening? But to your point, it's like if you can see other people doing it better and you're learning from them, then you can actually incorporate it into your own practices. And like he's like winning tournaments and all sorts. It's bizarre.
Yeah.
But
but this is an essential part of how we learn, is that we learn through seeing what other people are doing integrating that into our own performance. And when we're not able to do that, we have to engage in stuff that doesn't work as well, trial and error. We have to do this sort of difficult problem solving technique.
Yeah. And in the workplace, you made the point of like just the knowledge being cooped up in people's heads. One of the things I did last year for my organization is implemented a knowledge-based system. I kept hearing time and time again, people like were trying to retrieve files and information, asking repetitive questions to the same people or looking through their email or folders for something. Whereas like one place for all the knowledge, tutorials, videos, processes, like accessibility is like part of the learning process.
I mean, it's huge. I know this is like a pretty trivial example, but I think it shows this basic idea. I know a guy who he was running a fairly large sort of remote team that was doing things like customer service and that kind of stuff. And one of the policies that he had is whenever anyone encountered a problem that had not been documented before, they had to like turn on a screen recorder, show themselves doing it, annotating what they're doing, and then upload it to this documentation. And this was like part of their job. And so over time, this sort of repository ended up being like hundreds and hundreds of videos of every single kind of situation that you might face. This is how you deal with that problem. And I mean, this is just one example, but the difficulty in so many of our contexts is that, you know, if you don't know how to do something, you have to go bug the person next to you and stop them from doing their job and get this information. You know, the ability to externalize our knowledge and make resources for other people to learn on, I mean, it's huge for being able to learn these techniques. Early
in the book, you talk about 3 factors for getting better at anything. What are those?
Oh, right. Sorry. I thought you said one of those. One of those.
Sorry.
Yeah. What are those? I was like, one of those. And I'm like, okay, waiting for the rest of the question. Yeah. So the 3 are see, do, and feedback. So see, we've already talked about this basic idea that we learn most of what we know from other people. And so reducing barriers to making observational learning easier is one way to accelerate progress. And it's a particularly important one because often the gap between what we could do through our own trial and error and through other people's knowledge is huge. And so if you're just trying to reinvent the wheel, you're not going to get much further than the horse-drawn cart. You're not going to be inventing automobiles or airplanes. Now, the other 2 factors are equally important. Do, practice. Obviously, we have to practice a lot to get good at things, but it's really important to have a good mental model of what practice is doing. In particular, what practice does, or one of the main things it does, is it makes our performance more automatic, more smooth, less effortful. This is very important for skills that have a lot of complex little components that you have to be able to do very quickly and very smoothly in order to perform them. So if you're reading, for instance, and you're spending all of your mental energy trying to figure out, okay, C-O-M, you're spelling this in your head, you're not going to be able to understand what's being said. So clearly practice is very important there for reading because you have to perform the component skills with enough fluency so that you can even do any of the more advanced tasks. But practice also has this downside that if you get really fluent at doing something that's inefficient or not the best method, it can also hold you back. You know, I think most of us have the experience of learning to type. And for most of us, there's one of 2 ways that we do it. One way is that maybe you started out and you're hunting and pecking with your hands with 2 fingers, or maybe you took a typing class and you do touch typing with all of your fingers on the home row. Now, you can keep hunting and pecking for decades and you will get faster and more efficient at doing it. But that never spontaneously turns into touch typing without some deliberate effort on your part. And this is because practice makes whatever you're doing more efficient. It makes it smoother. It makes it more effortless, but it doesn't necessarily transform into the best method. So that's an important limitation of practice and the importance of practicing the right skills. And then finally, feedback. And we can get into that as well because there's some interesting implications for a lot of the kind of nebulous real world skills that we want to learn that without good feedback, often we get a lot of confidence in the skills that we're doing, but we're not actually that competent. So that's another area that's very important for improving our performance in the long run.
We'll definitely get into the feedback piece. I've got lots of questions around that. When it comes to problem solving, you introduce this idea of satisficing.
Yeah.
How does that apply when it comes to decision making and problem solving in the business world?
Yeah. So this is from the Nobel Prize winning economist and cognitive scientist Herbert Simon. He came up with this concept because When we're trying to solve a very well-defined problem, like you're trying to solve a math problem or a Rubik's Cube or something like that, there's pretty much just you've solved it or you haven't, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to rotate it, the Rubik's Cube, you either got all the colors on the side that they're supposed to be on or you didn't. And one of the reasons that things like solving Rubik's Cubes are difficult is that the amount of possibilities, the amount of different ways you could move the cube around is gargantuan. I think it's like something like 72 quintillion different ways you can move the Rubik's Cube. So if you're just trying them out at random, you're never, ever, ever going to get it. The only way you can do it is by using the right method. Now, real world decisions in some ways are even worse because we're dealing with a much, much more complicated space. The amount of different ways you could approach a business problem, a hiring decision, all of these things is enormous. There's way more possibilities of what you could do than you could even contemplate in your lifetime. So one of the things that Herbert Simon found when he analyzed people solving problems is they often do what they call satisficing, which is to not pick the best solution or to exhaustively list out all the possibilities and go through it, but to pick something that is good enough, to pick something that in that moment fits the criteria and does an okay job. And if you look at real world managers, real people in the office space, this is what they're doing all the time. Yep. They're not letting good be the enemy of, or great be the enemy of good. Like they are getting things done, which means you have to make a decision. And this is, I wholeheartedly endorse this. This is what we have to do in the real world. We are always satisficing, but it relates to what we were talking about observational learning, because what you do when you satisfice is you pick some way of solving the problem that works good enough. But this has two consequences. First of all, if you solve the problem that way and you continue to solve the problem that way, you kind of ingrain that solution procedure into your sort of processes for doing things. That goes from being, well, we fix this problem one time this way to this is just generally how we fix this kind of problem. And the second thing is because you're not searching exhaustively, because you're not trying out every single possibility, the chance that you landed on the best method are actually fairly low. For most decisions, there's probably a better way of doing it. And so for some of the decisions that we encounter repeatedly, we encounter the same situation, it can be a little bit like hunting and pecking on the keyboard, that we end up adopting a method that is not as good as other methods that could be out there if we could learn from observation from other people. But because we practice them repeatedly, that just becomes our habit. And then that can become a kind of organizational cruft where you find some sort of works enough, well enough way of doing things, and it gets embedded into your long-term policy.
Does discovering an answer for yourself lead to a deeper understanding of something versus someone or AI showing us how to get the answer? Because I've used AI for answers. So I had to bring that up, and I think people are relying on it more and more. But is there a deeper level of understanding one way or another?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of thinkers who have thought so. I mean, the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, he had this whole argument that, you know, it's much better to discover the answer for yourself than to learn it from someone else. And there's many people who holds that view. And I think there's sort of something intuitive about it, because obviously when you do something yourself, you solve the problem yourself, you're really paying attention to how it's done. You sometimes are able to get a deep insight that you might not get if you're copying. However, the research on that is actually a lot shakier than people think. And so there's a lot of research showing that, in fact, it can often be the opposite case, that showing someone how to solve a problem actually lets them use more of their attention, more of their resources to really understand what the solution is than if they just try things on their own. So an example that might be familiar to you is if you've ever played any of those kinds of, I don't know if you've ever seen any of these sort of like chain puzzles where they have like pieces of metal that have weird shapes and they're kind of linked together, and your goal is to like get them unhooked from each other. And sometimes if you're just jiggling it around, sometimes they just come apart and you're like, wait a minute, how did I do that? And so it's certainly possible to solve a problem without learning any enduring method. You just sort of, okay, I do this and that's how I solve it, but you haven't learned any sort of procedure for it. So I think the real sort of takeaway from the research and what we're talking about is not to resolve this particular controversy, but to say that learning through observation is a very important feature of how we learn. And copying other people's solution strategies, understanding other people's work, can be a road to understanding, just like your own problem solving efforts are. And so we shouldn't be in a situation where we want to like withhold the solutions to students, to new trainees, to people, because we want them to understand it themselves. Definitely providing people with this information is helpful. And I think particularly in a workplace context where we want to get stuff done and we want people to use the right approach, providing those ample resources is very helpful.
Yeah, that's well said. Does early success or failures increase or fuel motivation in the future?
Yeah. I mean, this is also another thing that like you hear the saying failure is the best teacher. This gets bandied around a lot, especially in this kind of
Demotivating,
world
though.
that I'm in with like, self-improvement, business book
Yeah.
advice. It's all about grit and persistence and perseverance and stuff. Now, this isn't to deny that, but it is to say that it's a basic truth that when we experience success, we are more motivated to do those things. And so when we have very little experience with something, we're a new trainee in a job, we don't have a lot of confidence yet in what we're doing, and we experience a lot of negative feedback, either a lot of frustration because we don't know how to do what we're doing, or a lot of like demotivating kind of, from the top down negative feedback. The most typical result is demotivation. The most typical result is not, oh, well, now I'm inspired to work harder. It's that I am going to just sort of tune out, or I'm going to not even try. And so what we need to do is build a base of success, build a base of confidence so that people can achieve some things. And then once they achieve some things and you build a little bit of confidence, then it's time to raise the challenge level. Then having those challenges can work, because usually when we benefit from persistence, when we benefit from taking on harder challenges, it's the case that taking on something difficult and then you persist, and then you succeed. That can be a very strong signal to persist in the future, because you've learned that when you try hard, sometimes it works out. Whereas if you try, and then fail, that's actually a really strong negative signal too. It tells you, okay, maybe you should quit next time ahead because it's actually impossible. So I think the motivational environment that we're considering, certainly as trainers, certainly as people who are like designing the workplace setting, we definitely want to bias the early experiences towards success. And we definitely want to bias new people who are getting started with these sort of building blocks that they need so that they understand enough so that when you give them challenges, they're actually able to tackle them and accomplish them.
You introduced this idea of like a difficulty sweet spot. And it got me thinking about how could we incorporate that into our training and development programs inside of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, so I think that just sort of as background here, there's lots of different areas in the research where like the same intervention, so the same kind of thing that we do to help learners, can either be helpful or harmful depending on where that learner is in the skill progression. So for instance, if you're just starting out, like we just talked about, having simpler problems, more structure, more guidance, seeing an example, these things tend to be beneficial. But as you get better, you need more challenge. You need to actually try to remember things for yourself if you want to get increased performance. I mean, it's a little bit like lifting weights. That would be the analogy I have. Like if you give someone a dumbbell that's way too light, then they're not going to train their muscles very much. But if you give them a weight that's too heavy, they're probably going to just injure themselves. And so finding the sweet spot is really important. And I think one of the ways that we can get to that sweet spot is by having these sort of practice cycles. I mean, most effective training policies have this sort of like see an example, do practice for yourself, and get some feedback. And you can use that feedback to calibrate it. So if you're failing too much, you can do things that make it simpler, make it easier. You provide a very similar example next to the thing that you're supposed to output, and that can be a good way to learn the technique. And as you get better, you can give more challenging problems to sort of enforce deeper levels of thinking or higher levels of skill.
When it comes to learning, what's more important, and maybe they're equally important, but variability over repetition?
Yeah, so this is another aspect of this same problem. So when you are learning things and you're very starting out, you're just at the very beginning of what you're learning, the complexity can be overwhelming. If you have no idea how to do it, then having the sort of patient explanation, the really tightly controlled conditions can be good. But one of the things that we found from psychology and psychological research is that often this sort of keeping things very similar, like we practice something in a very specific way. Like if you think about like when you did math homework when you were a kid, it was always, the same kinds of questions and there was the same template. You did them over and over and over again. And that's good to get the idea of it. But the problem is that if you only stick to that kind of very consistent practice, the skill doesn't generalize very well. So you get in these situations where you spent a lot of time practicing something in school, but then you have a hard time applying it on the job, or you have a hard time applying it in real life. And this is a major issue. We spend enormous resources with like professional development and these training seminars, and you go there and you do these little, role play exercises and things like that. And then you go back to work and you do things exactly the way that you always did them before. And so I think variability is a very promising strategy to help overcome that, because what you want to do is you want to try the technique, the idea, the concept, the practice in enough situations that cover the area that you want to actually perform them in. And I think that's very important for actually being able to use these skills. I think we waste a lot of money on our professional development or professional training programs because of this restriction in range, that you learn the skill, you're able to sort of superficially master it in that context, but then you go to the real office environment, you're not able to use it, you're not able to transfer it. And so it's kind of like, unless you get additional training at the office, it's kind of wasted.
I'm going to read a passage from your book that I found really fascinating. I want you to unpack it, and then I got a follow-up question to it. So the quote says, "Much of our potential creative output is eaten up by meetings, email, administrative overhead, and other minutiae." In Harriet Zuckerman's study of Nobel laureates, many scientists remarked that their research careers slowed considerably after having won the prize. While some of this might come from reduced motivation, many remarked that they felt overwhelmed by all the extra public attention, end quote. So in my mind, if we spent more time on creative output, we would potentially get more creative quality, because it sounds like with these award winners, they got bogged down in the meetings and the press and all this other stuff that they probably spent less time creating.
Yeah, it's interesting because after when I was sort of like finalizing the chapter, I read there's a paper that actually quantified it. So, I was sort of suggesting that this was the case, but it turns out that actually after you win Nobel Prizes and stuff, you are less productive as a researcher for sort of the reasons. So it's been confirmed. It is a real phenomenon. And I think this is true in many walks of life. Some of it is probably sociological. Some of it is that we promote the most productive people who are like the most productive programmer. We make them a manager, and maybe they're not that good at managing. And now we don't have our most productive programmer. We have like a not so good manager. So, I mean, that can happen in organizational contexts. And part of the issue is that, the programmer wants to be promoted. They want to have the higher status with the higher position, but maybe they're better off programming. Maybe they're better off not being also a project manager or also having these sort of administrative roles. So I think that can be an issue. The Nobel Prize winners, maybe we should just let them do science and not have them like chair committees and do a bunch of, administrative work. Like they were clearly brilliant at the work they were doing. Maybe we should just let them keep doing that. So I think that's one factor. Another factor is just related to Cal Newport's point about deep work. Now, Cal Newport, if you haven't heard of him before, he's an author. He wrote the book Deep Work, Slow Productivity, and none of these books. He's a frequent collaborator of mine. We've worked on some projects together. And he sort of divides up the world into deep and shallow work, with the sort of main distinction being that deep work is the work that requires you to focus on it, to pay attention for longer periods of time. And his argument is that there's something kind of sickly about our modern workplace environments. We operate in this sort of hyperactive hive mind where we're constantly sending emails to each other. We're constantly checking in on tasks. Like our workflows require this constant communication. But as a result, we fractionate the time that we have to actually concentrate and work on things. So certainly for creative output. So if you are having to do a product design, you're having to do a marketing plan, you're having to do some deep concentrated piece of work, you want to have 3, 4, 5 hours in a row to focus on it before you break off and get feedback and work on other things. And that's hard in our modern environments because we've kind of normalized the idea that, well, everyone should be interruptible at any moment, and that if you're not replying to emails in 5 minutes, then you're just not doing your job. And so I think there is some problems with that. And I think part of it is also related to the fact that, often the protocols for how to work are coming from the top down. So, it's the CEO who tells the VPs how to work, who tell the middle line managers how to work. And the manager's schedule is often one that is very communication derived. Like the manager benefits from being able to hear immediately how things are going. But often the people who have to do kind of the creative output work maybe require longer chunks of time. And so I think there's different ways that this can be resolved. But I think that's definitely a problem in modern kind of bureaucratic environment.
Given that experience doesn't always equate to expertise, how can organizations help their people get the expertise?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting problem. So I found when I was doing this research on learning, I came across Paul Meal's work. So he was a clinical psychologist, and he wrote this little book comparing what he called clinical versus actuarial prediction. So basically, you compare an expert's judgment versus a spreadsheet. So you say, okay, the expert is going to give their intuitive judgment. They've got 3 decades of experience working with people like this. What are they think's going to happen? So this is like hiring decisions about projects to pursue. It could be judges making decisions about a case. It could be parole officers deciding, whether a criminal is going to reoffend. These kinds of intuitive decisions. Or you could have a spreadsheet where you just collect a bunch of data from past cases, and you could do something really simple, like say like pros or cons, like, a list of pros, list of cons, which has more. Or you could do something a little more sophisticated. You could do something like a weighted sum. So you like some pros matter more than others, right? And the thing is that at the time he was sort of saying, well, it looks like from the few studies that have been published that the spreadsheets tend to do better. They tend to do better than human judgment. And he was thinking, well, maybe there's going to be a role for human judgment in the future, and there's going to be a place for this to come. And the more recent paper, so like kind of 50 years later, they published a report, and it was like, no, it turns out that actually the statistical algorithms work much better than human judgment in most of these cases. And I mean, this is pretty dispiriting, because if you have to make any of these kind of judgments in your job, so the classic example, if you're an HR professional, would be like hiring decisions, right? If you are going to decide to hire someone or choose who's going on to another interview or say yes or no to certain kinds of decisions, these are judgment decisions, right? And they depend on a lot of these factors. And what Meal's saying is that, 20, 30 years of experience could probably beat you with an Excel sheet. And I mean, that's pretty humbling. And I think there's a few ways that we can deal with this. So the first thing is that to recognize that in most of our sort of real world performance situations, the situations that Meal studies, we're not getting very accurate feedback about our decisions. So if you think about what happens when you hire someone, well, you pick one person and maybe they were a great hire and you pat yourself on your back for like finding this diamond in the rough, but you don't know what the other 99 people who sent in a resume and got rejected, what they would have been like, whether they would have been even better than this person or whether they would have gone on after you rejected them. You don't know where they're working now and whether they're actually moving up the ranks. And so because of this lack of feedback, it's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to calibrate, like how confident should you be in your decision making. The other thing too is that we often don't have good models to rely on as well. So the other sort of takeaway from Meals is that in many of our decisions, we should probably be actually trying to like figure out, well, what are the factors that go into making a good hire, and putting those in a spreadsheet to actually see, okay, what would be the sort of baseline prediction of who's going to be a good hire based on these sort of factors that we found are correlated with successful performance. So I think in our intuitive judgments, there's a lot of room for improvement because we spend years getting experience doing them. And that gives us considerable confidence, sort of related to what I was talking about before about increased practice, making our skills more automatic, more fluent, more effortless. It feels like you know the right answer. But there's considerable doubts that we're actually at the level of a performance that even Excel couldn't beat. Improvement is not a straight line, as you stated in the book. So how do leaders and managers and HR professionals, how do we help our people navigate the ups and downs of the learning process? Yeah. Well, I mean, the biggest thing you can do whenever you're learning anything is to try to get as close to the right method as possible when you're starting. I think this is more of an issue with skills that have like a very high degree of practice component. So, there's a reason why like experienced piano teachers will say like, I'd rather work with someone who's never touched the keys before than someone who's like an amateur player who's taught themselves, because the amateur player who's taught themselves has probably picked up some bad habits, and those are going to be very hard to drill out of them because they work sort of, they're like the hunting and pecking on the keyboard, and they're also really well practiced. If this person's been playing a lot, they've been doing it hundreds, thousands of repetitions, that's hard to overcome. It's probably a little less relevant for like pure knowledge domains. So if you're just sort of like ideas in your head, those are a little bit easier to overcome. But even there, we have this issue where you can learn things about the world, ways of thinking about the world, and ways of operating in your industry, ways of like tools for using and evaluating ideas, and you can get very comfortable with those. And that can often impede your progress for learning new things. I know there's the old physicist joke that science proceeds one funeral at a time. And it's just because if you spent a lifetime investing in one way of looking at the world, and then it turns out that there's another way of looking at it, or to use, our more practical example, if you spend a lifetime performing your skill in one way, and then there's a new way of doing it that comes around, a lot of those people are reluctant or have a difficult time making the transition because it often requires different skills. If you came of age analog domain, and then now all of a sudden they're doing your job with a digital world, it can be difficult to make that transition. And so I think supporting people and providing resources for reskilling is very important.
It's funny, that piano example. I'm like, I was thinking about my golf game. I've been golfing since I was like 11 years old.
Yeah.
Never had a lesson before. So I know I've acquired bad habits, but I'm a pretty decent golf player, but I've never gone and done lessons because I'm like, I know that they're going to try to untrain me, and I'm just doing it I'm not going for competitions or nothing. I'm just going out to have a good time. But
that's a good example too. Like if you are in your situation where you have mastered a skill in a certain way, someone who just says, okay, we're going to do it totally differently now and rebuild it. That can often be a mistake because it's going to probably lower your performance.
Yes.
So a lot of what they do, this is particularly in motor skills, but is to try to change the constraints of your environment, to try to shift you into a different way of doing things. So instead of being like, okay, you're going to move your body like this, change the way that you're golfing so that it can kind of nudge you towards a better way of solving those problems. So working with a good coach to design those kinds of constraints in your golf game is very important, I think, if you want to make progress.
Yeah, that's a good point. But for those, let's say I did want to make a drastic change and I needed to unlearn some of those bad habits. Is there a really good method for unwinding the bad habits that we've learned so I can move forward in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting kind of debate within psychology itself of whether unlearning is even possible, like whether we actually ever unlearn anything. I know we obviously forget things. So, there's obviously things that you forget, but it's not clear even when we forget things, whether it's because the memory's gone or just because we've kind of lost access to it. So it's in there somewhere, but you don't have the right reminder to bring it out of your brain. And so this is sort of an interesting phenomenon that, like, there's a lot of areas where if you spend a lot of time learning something, the memory may be there. It just lies dormant. And so I think the best way of trying to improve is, well, first of all, see if you can adapt what you're doing to the new scenario. So that's, it's always better if you can kind of like move between the ridges rather than going down into the valley where you might not come out on the other side. But then if you can't do that because you just actually have to do it a completely different way, then you do need to invest in a lot of practice in the basics so that the new technique you're using can compete with the old one, so that you have that fluency, that proficiency with the new way of doing things. I mean, this is sort of what we necessarily have to do in a lot of domains where we come equipped with some intuitions about it or some things that are derived from life experience that maybe are misleading. So I know there's a lot of research on people learning a subject like physics, where it's well documented that people have intuitions about physics, about like how things move just from interacting in the world, that are not quite right. So like the average person thinks that, well, if you push something and then it goes out, it'll keep going for a while and then it'll slow down and it'll stop. And that makes sense. We live in a world where there's, water and air and friction. And so that would happen. But that's not how physicists say it happens. Physicists says, like, if you were to push the block in a vacuum, it would keep going on forever, which is not intuitive. And so to learn the physical system, to learn the physics, it requires a lot of this investment in these formal ideas, because you have to get something so fluent that it can compete with, just like, well, yeah, obviously if you push it, it'll stop eventually, is the sort of default intuition we have, which kind of doesn't actually work that well when you try to formalize it in physics.
When you talk about intuition, it makes me think of when people say, I'm just going with my gut. And I've used that too. Like, you think you know something well enough that you're like, I just have this gut feeling. When should we use our gut and when shouldn't we? I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
An appropriate way to approach it.
So I do think intuitive decision making is important and can be very powerful, but I think there's a couple moderators on it. So the first thing is what is it that we're doing when we make that gut decision? And I think there's good evidence that a lot of what we're doing is we're pattern matching to a situation that we've encountered previously. So to use the hiring example, let's say I'm meeting some candidate and I just have like a good gut feeling about this person. What does that mean? What does that intuitive decision mean? And the research seems to indicate that what it probably means is that they sort of fit a template that we've learned somewhere else, that this person's a good candidate. We're not individually aggregating all the little features about this person and then sort of weighting each of those features like, well, they went to Harvard, so they get 3 points, and they, have 10 years of experience, so they get 8 points, and like however you want to do it. That's not what we're doing kind of behind the scenes in our head. And this is why the spreadsheet can often beat us, because even though the spreadsheet has way less information in making this decision than we do, they just have a few numbers on a chart, it can actually aggregate those things. Whereas what we do is we're like, you know what, this reminds me of that one time and whether it went well or whether it went badly. And that can be actually really misleading, because if you're in an environment where, well, yeah, but actually the best you can do is be right about 60% of the time. Well, that means that 40% of the time, the thing it reminds you of will be bad, and then you'll make the wrong decision. And so this is an area where I think if you're using your intuition, if you're doing this, it's helpful to hedge it against something like this, to have the kind of the model or the predictor or this kind of thing, because it's very easy to mislead yourself to be like, oh, I feel really confident and I'm using my gut. But this doesn't mean that our intuitions are always bad. I mean, expert intuition in an area where you have good feedback, where you have the ability to learn from this kind of repeated experience can actually be quite good. So we're pretty good at integrating in cues together. I mean, the psychologist Gary Klein, he studied experienced firefighters, and they were often uncanny in their ability to like enter somewhere and be like, oh no, this building's going to collapse, we got to go. And it would be like, how did they even figure out what they were doing there? And so intuition is good at kind of pattern matching, of taking situations and finding something from memory that seems to fit that pattern in the past. But what it seems to be not so good at is like, well, this is a sort of noisy domain. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. And the best way to do it is to just like aggregate all these pieces of information. Turns out we're very bad at that. And so I think that's an area, if that's the approach that works better, it's helpful to lean on tools like having a model, like having some kind of spreadsheet, or even just like pros and cons,
One of the biggest hurdles for, I think, getting better at anything or learning is getting out of our comfort zone. Do you have any like tricks or tips or mental strategies for getting out of a comfort zone?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what we mean by comfort zone. I think like sometimes our comfort zone is an emotional comfort zone, right? So like the outside of the comfort zone has some anxiety associated, some fear. Like if you're thinking about, well, me going and giving an open mic night at a comedy club is definitely outside of my comfort zone.
Right.
Like that thought kind of terrifies me. And so if I were wanting to build up to that goal, or I were trying to go in that direction, the research shows that exposure is very beneficial. So if I can expose myself to situations that approximate that closer and closer, I'll lower my fear response. It'll be more comfortable for me to do that. So in that sense, the comfort zone is emotional, and that's how we expand into it. But I think comfort zone can also just be from inertia. We just don't get the idea to improve ourselves, to take on a new project, to try something that's outside the ordinary. I mean, especially if you're busy, you've got kids at home, you work all day, this kind of thing. Just getting by can often feel like it's hard enough that you don't want to add to that. You don't want to add some new challenge. But the problem is that it's a little bit like exercise, right? If we don't exercise because exercising, we're too tired for that, then we get kind of out of shape. And then we're just sort of generally more tired in life. And so similarly in our professional lives or in our careers, if we always try to like, okay, stick with what I know, stick with what I'm good at, stay in that zone, you narrow yourself until you get to a point where it's like, well, actually I need to make a change, but it's so far out that I'm not able to do it. So I think doing things and taking that proactive step to like take on little challenges, take on goals that interest you, whether those are at work or outside of that, I think are very important for, being active, being dynamic in your skill set.
That's very well said. Let's wrap up with this. Does measuring performance help in any way, like support the learning process?
I think it can. I definitely think that metrics used properly are extremely powerful. Like we were just talking about the issue of intuition. And I think one of the major problems of intuition is that we don't have any calibrated feedback, right? So, if you're a skilled poker player, you also deal with a noisy environment, but you get a lot of feedback about how much money you win, how much you lose, which hands you won on, which hands you lose on. Like there's all these ways to improve your performance. Whereas a lot of the skills that we engage in, we don't really get much feedback at all. And we certainly don't get any quantitative feedback. And so it can be very difficult to tweak our performance in those domains. But that being said, metrics, especially in an organizational context, they're not just information, right? They're also incentives, and they're also performance tracking, and they're also constraints. And so, there's this phenomenon known as Goodhart's law, which is sort of like whenever you set something to be what's optimized for, it no longer measures the thing you care about. It's sort of like, okay, as soon as we made papers published, the thing that mattered in academia, then all of a sudden how many papers you publish is no longer a really good metric of how good a researcher you are. Because even if it mattered before that point, even if it was like, oh, well, the amount of papers you publish was a good measure of your productivity as a researcher, as soon as people are aiming for that metrics, then they sort of distort it by, writing kind of not so good papers, or they take one idea that would have been one paper and split it out into 15 to drip it over. And so I think when we're doing metrics, and I think when we're thinking about improvement in our organizations, we have to take both views into account. So we have to take into account that if I'm not able to get data about how I'm performing my skill, if I'm not able to get these calibration feedback, these benchmarks, there are many skills that may just simply be unlearnable, or it may be the case that I can only plateau at a very low level of performance. On the other hand, if I start setting up, well, these are the benchmarks and these are the things that are necessary to get raises and promotions, and this is the decisions that we're making at an organizational level, which is, of course, the temptation every company has, is to sort of metricify and gamify everything. You may end up being that those metrics actually end up being much less informative than they would be otherwise, because people find ways to game them. They find ways to achieve the metric without achieving the reason that it was stated for. So my sort of philosophy is that we want to create tools for people that they can use for themselves to have their own improvement. But we want to be careful that the tool that we're giving is not also something that we're, dangling the carrots and sticks out there, so that they may, instead of using it for improving themselves, use it to distort whatever their performance is to reach the numbers.
Scott, this is a really fun discussion. It went fast. We covered a lot of ground, but not everything that's in your book. So I encourage people to go get it. It's called Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. Where do you want to point people to? Any parting thoughts or anything like that?
Sure. I mean, anyone who's interested can check out my website, scotthyoung.com. I have literally thousands of articles there, free books, links to Get Better at Anything and my previous book that was published with Harper, Ultra Learning. And, I have a podcast there. I have lots of resources. So if you are interested in any of these topics and digging deeper, feel free to check it out.
My guest today has been Scott Young, the author of Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery. Scott, thanks for going on.
Thank you for having me.